how ultimately will the tariffs be used to pay for the assets? And I believe that it could impact the way that the project moves forward. So, for example, I mean, it's going to come down to, what are the solutions for Tote? What are the solutions for Madsen? And how are you going to allocate the costs between the two? And if there's not clarity about how those costs are going to be allocated by individual users, you're going to come up with solutions, and then you're going to get friction later. And my concern is that we don't address that issue up front, and it ends up getting things into, or continuation of what we've done in the past, where we haven't really talked about how we're going to pay for things in advance. The next item that I think should or could use additional help is create and implement stakeholder engagement and communication plans. And I know that there's clearly intent to move forward with that, but I think it needs to be higher profiled, and it needs to be implemented, or the same level of review that it's coming up with looking at the different types of docs. We need to figure out how we're going to do that, to establish that broad range of support around the state. And I think the Assembly's done a good job in terms of getting to AML, broadcasting a resolution, and that's one piece. But I think it should be looked at in a wide, comprehensive fashion.
Before you move on, I have a question from Ms. Alito.
Thanks, and maybe you're going to get to this, Mr. Deluski, but as I'm going through the report and as you're talking about the plan of finance and kind of how we're moving forward, I noticed there's some recommendations specifically about how we go about getting bids on the work that's proposed to be done, and I'm not really clear on it and how it's explained in here, and I don't know if you plan to talk about that a little bit more.
Okay.
And the follow-up is have you talked to the municipality and purchasing at all about this, or is this just the start of an idea that we need to follow up on?
So if you look under constructions, investigate ways to increase bidder interest, and that's the first element under on the 11 by 17 sheet. It's in yellow, and there is efforts undergoing to establish dialogue with contractors to get more people bidding, and so that's a positive step that ties directly into the phase of the next bidding effort. And I put yellow for a couple reasons. One of them is I don't know how deeply the discussions have been with the contracting community. My perception is that it may not be probing as deeply as could be done, and I think that would be beneficial to get more clarity of how they're going to bid, but I haven't had direct discussions with the purchasing or the administration regarding that. And the other thing that ties into the other issue, and I think it's a larger issue, is it relates to the element of employment of the design build maximum guaranteed price format, and that's a more controversial recommendation. It didn't necessarily get that much support after passage of the initial draft, and the more that we move forward, the more strongly I feel that is a large issue that should be probed. I didn't include it in 2020, and that was because it's something that I believe should be done, but there's this initial work that needs to be done in 2020, partially defining more from my perspective, we should be defining our revenue sources. We should be defining what our basic thing of what we want to build. And once we're at that point, then that would become more of a priority, and it's beyond the 2020 issue.
So whether or not a design build maximum guarantee price bid process is used, that doesn't necessarily play a key role in terms of whether or not you then just what's the other term I'm looking for, design to the budget that you're setting. So those two don't have to go forward at the same time. You could go forward with one and then consider the other.
Well, I believe that the design build maximum guaranteed price is a good way to design to budget. I'm in alignment with the administration, and in that for the PCT we move forward with a design bid build sort of project, and that's progressing well. It's underway. Financing is hand. So then, but once we get into the remainder of the implementation, I do believe that's where the design build maximum guaranteed sort of format would come into play, and that's where you really get where designing the budget becomes even more critical.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ro, would you orient me as you go through this on, and you mentioned it, but on scope and the basic thing of what we want to build? Because it's my understanding we haven't achieved alignment yet on what it is we need to build. And I would like to have clarity on exactly how we get there to that place of alignment, and who ultimately, or how will we determine what it is that we need to build that will meet our needs.
And I do think that the administration and the users are working in a harmonious fashion to help figure that out. So those are a lot of the elements that are in green under programming. So the users are going to give their facility requirements. They've agreed to that, and that's going to be helpful to help refine that. There's a round table that it's going to discuss. That they'll talk through different options. One of the main things that's there, a big question is there the potential to have one joint use terminal, and that the users are taking the lead in that in terms of really defining the logistics, and one of the primary issues that they're saying is very problematic is how their Tacoma operations work, and I'm sure that they can articulate this better than me, but they're going to research that, and in a collaborative fashion, working with the administration, are going to lay that out, and that's really going to probe that issue of can we get by with one joint use cargo terminal or two. So and then CH2M Hill is looking at some of the things about other ways of can you or how do you avoid installation of another petroleum terminal? And they're looking at 3 different options on that. So I think that's underway. They're evaluating renovation in place. They're evaluating trestles only. So there's a lot of things that they're doing now that are good. There's a couple minor elements that I have check marked on here that it's not clear to me that they're looking at. For example, looking at drilling, that could enter into the drilling pile rather than driving pile. That could enter into the elements, and it's something relatively minor. But I think there's a good process in place now over the next 5 or 6 months to really refine what that overall scope is. And so I think there's been definitely positive movement in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please continue.
So reevaluate pile drilling for new and renovation and place work. I just spoke to that as another item. That may be under review. it's a smaller issue, and it could enter. To me, it particularly would enter into the renovation in place potential concept. So it's a tool that potentially should be there, and I'm hoping that would be implemented by Jacobs in their review. Perform independent PE seismic design manual and program guidance review. That's if you asked me about the colors and if there was any of them that would be red. That's if I would have put a red one, that probably would have been a red one. And that is something that I think is very important. I don't think it has any traction based on and primarily on the discussions that I had with the project team. So basically it's saying Jacobs has come up with evaluations and methods and elements about how the project is going forward, and I'm saying step back, look at those. And the reason I'm doing that is I think it could have a tremendous impact on what the technical solutions are. And it's not looking at the north end and necessarily in what to do on the north end, but it's what are we doing in terms of our new pile supported structures, and what are the parameters that go into that. And my belief is that there's been some overly conservative elements that entered into that will have an impact on future elements. And when you combine it with the high seismic elements, and it could drive some of the solutions. So this issue to me could be a couple $100 million issue that it could make you enter into very expensive solutions that potentially you don't need to spend all that money. So I would clearly recommend that there is a evaluation of some of the base assumptions that went into the project, and that be done outside of the project to make sure they're impartial elements. I had recommended in the report that PN&E potentially administer those contracts.
I have a question for you, Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Ro, could you refresh our memory? What do you mean when you say, what do you mean exactly when you say there's overly conservative elements? Can you be a little more specific?
So probably some of it. One of the main elements has to do with what's the strength of the underlying soil, and how does that react in an earthquake, and that's one of the largest element. But then there's other elements in terms of what ice forces do you use, what are your what sort of berthing energy loads should you use in the design. So there's a and that guidance was established early on in the program, and I'm saying go back in and take another look at that, because my belief is that there are very conservative elements that are coupled on top of one another, and then you add in this whole the seismic review to minimal damage for seismic, and you're just creating an extremely conservative structure, which it ends up costing money. And so that's my recommendation.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to really underscore what Rose said. Once you raise the flag of safety and so on and so forth, it makes it very difficult for somebody to bring forth another perspective on it. And I think he's exactly right. And the impact of making a decision based upon very statistically very remote combination of events, could drive an order of magnitude on this. And that evaluation, I think, that's just a very wise one that I would encourage us all to pay attention to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Alatel?
Thank you. Following up on Mr. Dyson, I have a kind of a historical question, this is really for the body, but has the body made a policy determination on the level of resiliency for the port in a previous action by resolution or otherwise?
Mr. Constant?
Yeah, I think that we did pass a resolution that said we support a high level of seismic guarantee. I forget the exact language that it was, but that we didn't want to go backwards on that project. But it was related directly to that project. And how to get moved into the question of the overall next phases. And that is the kind of question of who's the winner, if you will, in the high seismic level, and the loser, because they might have to pay for it. Right, and so there's a lot of conversation along that topic that we still have to resolve.
Okay, so if I could have someone help me find a copy of that resolution, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I believe it was AR 2019-267, I believe is the resolution.
Thank you.
And that is, it's a very good question, and it ties directly into the issue of why I was recommending that they go forward with these additional studies. And so from a competitive perspective, Toten Sealand would like to, they don't want to necessarily have one firm get an advantage by having a seismically resilient dock and the other one not. And again, it gets into who's going to pay for that, and it would be, potentially, it would be very, it would be clearly simpler to, if you just had a trestles only dock, to make that seismically resilient versus an entire container crane dock that is much larger area. And so that's a lot of these elements that I've recommended kind of tie in together, but that's a central issue that, who's going to pay for this, and how's it going to get paid for, and don't push that off till last, but do it on the early side. Next item that was somewhat controversial: perform as-built survey on North Extension sheet pile. It's my understanding that the administration is moving forward with an as-built survey for at least the pile-supported docks, and I think it would be very simple, very cheap, very easy to go out and also at the same time do a survey for the North Extension, and that would be clearly something that could be done easily and at very low cost in the upcoming future. Another item I added: consider adding disputes review board for design bid build contracts. That one directly relates to the next phase of the PCT, and it would be incorporation of that clause into the project. Marine projects are they're highly risky sorts of projects from a lot of perspectives, and implementation of a DRB into the process would be a good way to do that. The municipality has done that in the past.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to ask you, is this something normal that takes place in a project the size of this?
There's a lot of different ways to handle risk, and it's fairly common. And I would say maybe 10% of the project, or 5 to 10% of the projects that I've done have employed that structure. So it's not an everyday occurrence, but marine projects by nature are good or risky, and I think it would be a good addition for that next contract.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The last item that I had on elements that could use help, or that I would recommend moving forward with now, is modify via ordinance the modification of the Port Commission. And I think there's some positive things that have happened in terms of integration. So there's discussion about a stakeholders group. to administer the project, and I think that's a good solution that I'm sure the administration will speak forward to, and there's going to be regional representation. So it's a part of it, but we're still recommending that even with the steering group that is formed to look at more of the management of the project, that there's modifications to the ordinance structure. So there's elements that I think that Ascent and Northern Compass Group could help. I think that potentially in the event that the administration would like help working on the plan of finance, creation and implementation of stakeholder engagement, and potentially doing the independent PE seismic and program guidance review, administering that, and also on the ordinance for port governance. And I just wanted to lay that out I wanted the Assembly to know that we've been appreciative in terms of working with you, and would like to continue to help. And I just wanted to make it clear that we're if possible, would like to continue on helping you. And that's it.
Okay.
And Rose, can I?
Yes, Mark.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
I'll just add just a little bit more, but first, thank you, and I want to echo what Rose said. We really have appreciated working with you all, get through that first phase and understanding what the pieces of the puzzle are and what needs to be done. But I want to emphasize just a couple things. One is these issues we've laid out for 2020, and I'm assuming I assume you understand this. Lots of those will go simultaneous. They don't just stack one on the other. But the part that I want to really underline here, and I can't remember who asked the question, but Roe emphasized it. I want to really emphasize it. You have to develop the plan to finance, because in order to build to the budget, you got to know what the budget is. Part of that will be based on what you can get and how you will get it and when you get it. And as you know, in the report, we laid out great detail of those categories. I know I've had a conversation on Saturday with the governor specifically about the port. I'm here in Washington, D.C. right now in a variety of different meetings, but this has come up in a couple, just in a broader sweep of issues. And all these, on the budgetary issues, if there's not a strategy now, every month you wait, you could literally be adding a year to 2 years on some of those funding cycles because of the way they work. And it's not just about apply for a grant, but it's an overall strategy of where do you spend your time at certain parts of the year and focus and getting, if it's a statewide bond or if it's a stream of revenue in the federal government or it's a programmatic change with the federal government funding sources, or it's again leveraging private sector dollars, a variety of things. I cannot emphasize this enough, because you are now about to hit February. Since the report has been done, that's 3 months. The session has started in June. The legislature, or Washington, D.C. is kind of logjam now over the impeachment, but as soon as it's over, which will be February 4th approximately, they'll go into high gear into their budget for 2021-22. So I guess, the folks that asked that question about build to the budget, you got to have a budget, and that's important, which is somewhat odd because you're going to also probably ask the question, well, we don't know what the budget is until we know what the costs are. Well, you got to drive it to the budget, and that will help drive the price, and then get you into that longer discussion that Rose talked about with design, build, guaranteed maximum pricing. The other thing, and it's kind of the last on that list of items that Rose just talked about, you should also, you guys had some really positive, the city did, the assembly, the mayor, others came out very positive as you laid out the draft plan, what you think the costing could be. It served to turn the dial in a positive way, the public perception of the port. But there's more work to be done there in the sense of the branding and the activity that's necessary to get funding people convinced that this is a real project that can be done with the right kind of budget. And lastly, in regards to the first, I think it was the first item that Roe talked about, project management, it's very clear to us, because of the magnitude of this project, that you do have to have something other than just, and this is not any disrespect to the port staff, but they got to run the port every day, ships coming in, ships going out. This is a multi-year, hundreds of millions of dollar investment. And in order to be, in my opinion, and I think Roe agrees with this, because we made this as our recommendation, is you have to have a project management team that really is focused on this every single day, not necessarily a consultant who's engineering it, but someone who's driving the train and making sure it's going to happen over a period of time. And there's obviously more detailed recommendation around that in the report itself. And I said that was last, but the last thing I will say is I think you folks here of the Assembly, just your engagement at this level has really started to make a difference. I think Roe mentioned many different times how there's more engagement, more action, more conversations, and the Assembly pushed that envelope hard, and rightfully so, because there's millions of dollars that you all have to approve or administer in some way through the budgetary process. So, again, I'll end on that. It's been a great opportunity to help move this along. We're happy to help any way we can, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I'll just end at that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
So I just want to summarize the highlights that I see. This is kind of what I had asked for in this review was a work plan for us for the next 12 months. What should we be looking at through the end of this year? So we're orienting ourselves now so we can benchmark what we're doing, where we're going, what we've done. And the primary takeaways that I see from this one is to be working on, with the administration, the development of a balanced plan of finance. That's an extraordinary high goal you have to work on. The creation of a communications plan and a stakeholder engagement plan that begins to actively build our relationships across the state to achieve our plan of finance and our broader goals. The question that Roe puts on, performing an independent analysis of the design, the seismic design manual, that's a conversation that we may want to engage in more fully. We'll get the conversation, I think someone asked for the resolution, and we'll have that talk. Then under construction, the discussion was the review board. That one really jumps out. And then finally, the question of modifying by ordinance the nature of the port commission and how it works. And so those, I think, are the primary takeaways. There's a lot of detail. And of course, the next step is to hear from the administration where we're going to go.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, so this meeting's going to go one, so we may do the administration next,
Yep.
is that right? Okay, because I mean, the other thing, Chris, I like all that. The other thing from these recommendations, and the administration will talk about this, is our budget process at the end of this year. Should we be talking seriously about budgeting in our budget an MOA employee or multiple employees to take it forward, like they're suggesting, right? And I guess I'd like to hear from the admin about that. And typically, we do everything. The port has its own budget; they do their own thing. But maybe there should be an MOA employee.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Just a detail, Roe. When you recommended some analysis of drilling as opposed to driving piles, if we drill, do we have less stringent marine mammals monitoring that has to be done?
Yes.
Thank you. That could be, what's the order of magnitude of the difference in the cost?
I know you like short answers, so I believe it needs to be looked at. So it likely the amount of decibels is a lot less than
Right.
impact driving, so that's positive. And there's a lot of variables about how exactly they do that could affect that. So I can't really fully quantify that. I do think it's something that should be investigated, and it could be a very good solution.
And could it, if I make it to you, is there a possibility it eliminates the having to have environmental monitoring folks on board all day and night when the project is going forward?
Probably not.
Okay, thank
But
you.
it would likely limit the radius of observation.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Mr. France?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, to Mr. Constance, board plan for the next 12 months. So I'm assuming that scope definition is implicit then in the balanced plan of finance, because then we still have a number of those steps to go through.
So if I might, I think therein lies the rub. So the report recommended we implement a build-to-budget model, right? The paradigm we've been operating under is we have a project, we work on it, get a budget and scope, and we develop it. That's a smaller piece of the larger whole. And so I think therein lies part of the tension of this conversation, because if you build to the project without an eye on the overall cap, if you will, the budget itself, then you don't actually scope the whole thing out as much as you can. But I understand the administration and the users are intending to work over the next several months to hone in more closely on the actual scope. And those questions that seem to be the challenge are, who gets or who is the seismic resilient dock? Are we going to do 2 or can we do 1? All of those questions have to be resolved. And so, but the report, I think, recommended, and I continue to hear the suggestion, that instead of that, we also could approach this from an alternative perspective, and that would be to say, here's our proposed budget, now back build to that. Tell us what you can do within that framework. And so that's the rub, I think, of this whole talk. And so I look forward to seeing where the administration leads us in this conversation to answer that question.
You know, and I would just add that finance and scope are so intertwined, and we have to have an absolutely clear idea of our basic needs. We don't want to overbuild, we don't want to underbuild. I mean, in the extreme example where there would be, funding available, we wouldn't necessarily want to build to that magnitude of funding if it was too much for what we needed. And so I guess I just want to have absolute clarity that when we talk about the finance too, we are keeping in mind the basic needs. And I'm not necessarily talking, as far as like pie in the sky, but just what we need to be able to function. So thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think that's where they're going to come together. The conversation has broadly been, we're working on these projects. I have heard from community stakeholders who say, the only answer is to listen to the users. They're going to tell us what they can and will do. And so this whole process has led us to the point where the users we're engaged, listening to what the users and the administration are saying. And so I think we'll get to that point this year, hopefully.
Right, and I understand too, follow up, that it's a policy decision as well to make some of those determinations as far as like, what does the public need, what do the other stakeholders need, and from these steps, I think, we're on the track to get there. But again, budget and scope inextricably intertwined.
And the budget will be influenced by the seismic decisions that are finally made, how many docks we build, what they can do in Tacoma to reorganize the operations. All of that is implicit, which in some ways leads to the conversation about having people directly working on the project and only on the project. And I know that we have some people who really are doing a lot of work down there. And I was in the queue just to speak to the fact that one thing that's not listed here, it was suggested that we consider having a direct person whose job it is 100% only to work on the port. And I was having that conversation with folks pretty well placed in the port administration, and they suggested to me that before we go to creating a position, that what we might ought to do is ask the port to look at its entire operation and tell us if there are ways that they would like to change in the kind of, as this is a benchmark time between how we've operated up till now and how we're hoping to do things differently. So rather than us saying, hey, we want you to do this one position, look to them to tell us how they could streamline their operations to provide that direct focus that's needed if the assumption is it's not there.
All right, so I am going to keep us moving on. I'm going to cut this portion of the meeting off at 12 so that we can move on to the administration and port users.
We'll go anywhere yet.
Ms. Alatel?
Thank you. My biggest concern as we look at this and we talk about all the what ifs is I would like either the administration and consultants to kind of give us some kind of identification of decision deadlines or schedules so that we can start to set some parameters around this. So are we talking about a new position in budget for 2021? Is it something needed sooner? Like, I just feel like it can be really amorphous and big, and that will just never move the ball forward because there's so many unknowns. And so I think that's really important because we've asked the legislature to possibly put this on a statewide bond. So we need to be kind of clear on what our schedule is moving forward, even if we don't know the answers. Like, at least when we're hoping to get to the answers, or realizing we still don't know the answer and how much longer it might take.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, it's fine.
Mr. Weddleton?
A couple of quick ones, and maybe is Mark still on? Mark, you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So yeah, question. So we're suing MARAD, and have been in that process for a while. So and then we go to the federal government and say, give us more money for our port. Isn't that the same people we're suing?
Yeah, this is the thing. Thankfully, the federal government is so big that yes, and here's why. I know there's been discussion that people say that we can't go to them because we're suing them. That is just not accurate. There is desire among other communities around the country to fund port infrastructure. So there are efforts being talked about, and we would be foolish not to be able to figure out how to wedge Alaska Anchorage specifically into this mix. So the cities around the country sue the federal government all the time, but it never stops them from going to ask them for resources. So they're, MIRAD is not because they took the support project on as a very unique project for MIRAD. This is not where you end up asking for the money in the future. MIRAD is not going to be the tool or the plate. There's other departments and agencies that would be interested in Anchorage, as a port, and because it has a service to all of Alaska. There's homeland security issues, there's DOD issues. So the simple answer is yes, the city's suing them, but that should not stop the city and the state from asking for resources, because they will treat them separately.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
So, and I just so the two cargo docks are mostly shared by Toad and Matson. Is that right?
Correct.
Those are the two big ones.
Yeah.
So and I see someone from Toad here. So you're down to one barge right now.
Well, we're down to one ship right now. We're going through a LNG conversion through the second week of February.
Okay. But crisis hasn't happened. My company's still getting the shipments. I mean, so there is some room in the system to juggle things a bit.
Well, with regard to the conversion, we're doing it at a very specific time of the year where we can manage the capacity and the demand of this market. I mean, typically doing something like this over any other period of time would greatly disrupt goods to the state. And so it's taken us about a decade to make this work.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, thank you. Chris, I like your idea. We have a few in our state, people who have immense experience with the geotechnical stuff and soils conditions and constructions on them, both onshore and ports and so on. And the state has one of those people on a retainer, and who, as I understand it, really works with some of the local people to say, here's the areas you got to watch out for, here's the data we got to be collecting, and so on and so forth, and saved them tens of millions of dollars, and they were being taken advantage of by contractors and so on, and didn't even know it. And there's a month-long trial going on in Juneau right now because they drop-kicked the contractor out of business, and because of fraud, and falsifying reports and shoddy work. So there's an opportunity with very reasonable investment to have somebody like that kind of on a retainer, and then we pay them by the hour, when they do it. But the leverage that they have with that kind of expertise has turned out to be really, really valuable. And so that's a worthwhile thing we ought to consider. Yeah, so Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Constant.
Yeah, just Mr. Weldon, to the point of MARAD and funding, we were told last year, oh, don't come until you've settled, but then we did receive a $25 million grant. So evidence says they do and are interested in supporting our efforts.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ro and Mark. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the administration. Who is presenting from the administration? All right.
Ro, drop the mic. For the record.
Okay. Let me know when to begin. Or should
Go
I
ahead.
wait for Mr. Johnson? Okay. So, the administration had a good meeting to kick off what we're calling Phase 2 of the Port Modernization Program last Friday. And I wanted to read you in to a bit of what happened there, and then to further continue our experiments in radical transparency and make you the beginnings of a pitch, which nobody has seen because I finished doing it at 11 p.m. last night, but which should get the ball rolling. So, what did we talk about? We met with everybody on Friday. Here's our agenda. We talked at the beginning about our port, our municipal organization and governance. We went over the preliminary roadmap, and we invited some early conversations from all of the users. My portion started this way, which was to say, we wanted to make sure everybody understood what kind of a beast the municipality really is, and what kind of system we have actually put in place to govern the modernization program. And I think that's worth retracing for this group, because I think there's real confusion about what Jacob's role is here. And then to very briefly retrace what the petroleum cement terminal process was, all with the design towards a general feeling that we need a better mousetrap. And that is because I think we have a shared vision that we want affordable, reliable port that serves our needs, and that we now have the beginnings of the solution for fuels, a total solution for cement, but we have no solution at all yet for cargo in place, and that is both unsolved and on a critical path timeline, so that's where our attention needs to focus. And I think we have all recognized out of the petroleum cement terminal process that we need a better structure to ensure consistent stakeholder engagement and buy-in, that we need earlier, reliable cost-benefit information, and that we need to build something that will outlive us, because the cargo solution is not going to be built until at least 5 years from now. There will be a different mayor. Everyone will have been reelected or replaced by that point. So, with that, our goals were to figure out the beginnings of what that new process could be and to begin to surface discussions about how we inform what the program inputs are. So, we talked generally about the municipality, but I'll skip over that for this group because hopefully we all know what the municipality is, but to say what is going on with Jacobs. And I think there is confusion about who Jacobs is and whether you have someone who is dedicated to just the port modernization program. The answer is yes, and you're spending millions of dollars on it every year. So, in 2014, we awarded a contract to CH2M Hill Engineers to do project and construction management services. That was approved, and what did that entail?
Mr. Balls, before you go there, I just wanted to assert that I have long heard concern that they, as a contractor, are not necessarily as clear-eyed and unbiased a vendor as we might want. And so any assertion that they are that thing has to be tempered with the reality that there are still questions.
Okay, well, I think that we will give you a process which will ensure that all of those concerns would be surfaced and addressed. But a reminder of who they are and what we have hired them to do. So they are supposed to be providing and are providing the key project administration and control services, which means that we are staffing a whole project management office. You have seen Jeff Poole and some of the cast of characters, but where is Jeff? How many do we have in the project management office now, and how many have we had at its max?
We have now about 6, and max this summer with the construction will be up to about 15.
So we are scaling that to the program needs. When we have a lot of activity, we have more folks. When we have less activity, we have fewer folks. They give us the comprehensive project management plan to develop the overall project schedule and budget. They are also doing key planning and design management services, and that means advising us generally on all of the planning, design, and environmental requirements that we are going to have to hit, that they're going to facilitate the process for those permits, where we need an Army Corps permit or a National Marine Fishery Services permits, doing all the cost-benefit trade-off information, looking at the various design and construction delivery method alternatives, coordinating the work of our designers and builders, and emphasize here, they are not the designers. So Jacobs helps us manage and ride herd over the designers we ultimately hire, and then to do a detailed peer review of all that, including the plans, specifications, cost estimates, and report. When we actually pivot to really constructing, they are a construction management company, so they do the site management, they're administering our construction contracts, they're negotiating change orders, making recommendations to us, and then doing all the on-the-ground inspection. So that apparatus exists, and that is the only thing that they are tasked to do. To make that more concrete for the petroleum cement terminal project then, so we hire Stage 2M Hill, which becomes Stage 2M, and then we have Jacobs. You've also seen HDR involved. Jeff, do you want to tell us how HDR gets involved and what they're doing?
So HDR is a subcontractor to Jacobs, but we really kind of are a team. Jacobs supplies staff for certain aspects like design management. HDR supplies staff for construction management and permitting specifically.
And then moving forward in the petroleum cement terminal, we hire a designer of record in May 2017, which is COE. COE is independent from Jacobs, does not have a relationship with Jacobs, and we do not have a designer of record yet for any other portion of the modernization program. That would come at some point. There is a firewall between the two. Then you recall we had an independent cost estimator, Moffitt and Nichols, so we would have our own internal estimate. COE would do an estimate, Moffitt and Nichols would have an estimate. And then we started in the construction manager at risk arrangement, where we did attempt an alternative delivery method where we had Hewitt and Manson help us design and do constructability analyses. And the idea was that they were going to build a petroleum cement terminal, but we couldn't come to price terms with them. So then we pivoted back to the more standard design bid build arrangement, and that's where Pacific Pile Marine comes into our lives.
Before you move on, Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill, for Jacobs and their role, if you go back to what we've hired them to do. So 2 questions, and this is not at all to impugn Jacobs, the people there. I'm sure that I have no reason to have any suspicion, but is there anything in their contract that gives them an incentive to reduce costs, to save costs for the municipality in the way that a direct municipal employee might have? And the second question is, there's a recommendation from Rose Group that we sort of reverse order and start with a plan of finance and amount of money and try to build with that. Is that part of their contract? So if we were asking, okay, go find what a plan of finance would look like, go figure out how much money we can raise, whether it's $700 million or $800 million, is that part of their contract?
I'll take them in reverse order. I think, broadly speaking, the helping us develop the plan of finance is within the scope of the contract, but it's not. It's more like chasing the grant opportunities rather than building the whole of the. Here's the total amount of money we're going to have.
Opportunity pursuit by providing project descriptions and technical information that goes into the grant application. We have no role in the plan of finance as it's described as a whole.
So before you go to the second question, so who, or maybe you could answer, so who does? Who has that role? Who is putting together that overall plan of finance and saying, I think we can get $200 million from the legislature, I think we can get $500 million from the feds, or much smaller numbers, whatever it is?
The administration, and that's going to be the ultimate punchline, because I think we do have an idea of how we can better create that plan of finance going forward. Okay. So we'll reserve that question. And then on the first question, does Jacobs have an incentive to save money?
Save our money.
Save our money. I guess the answer is yes, but I'm not sure what I can point to in the contract. But because they are our right-hand man and women in this project, they aren't designing the project, they aren't constructing the project, they're helping be our advocates. So when we couldn't come to terms with Hewitt Manson, it was partly because Jacobs was advising us, this is more than we think you should spend for this project. So there are more concrete things that you're looking for there, let me know. But generally, they are our advocates here.
I have a few more questions. Mr. Constant?
So watching the room behind you, heads are shaking furiously left to right, to left to right. And so there is, to me, clear evidence that that is certainly not an agreed upon position in the broader community of port users. And I think it's a very important question of how do we tackle a project when many of the stakeholders' best value comes from more work, not from a delivered project. You know, value to themselves and their shareholders and profits and bottom lines. And so that is a concern that I continue to hear that we really do need to grapple with.
Thank you. Ms. Alito?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Folsey, what's the current arrangement that we have a contract with Jacobs? What kind of contractual thing did we use? Was it, something put out for bid? Okay, sorry.
Yes.
You go fast, and I can't read as fast as you go, so.
So we did a request for proposals in 2013.
Okay.
I know there were multiple respondents, but I couldn't tell you how many of us sit here now.
Okay.
And then ultimately, that administration came to the assembly and said we would like authority for $30 million to hire Jacobs for a several year period. And I know we're already in the options period, but that's where we're at.
And do those options get exercised and approved by the assembly then?
Only if they require more money than this has already authorized, and we aren't there yet.
Okay, thank you. I'll jot down that.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Oh, fast. Can you leave it up there so I can write down the AM number?
Sure.
I just want to identify with the remarks to Mr. Costa. Extraordinarily difficult to get the best out of a contractor who has skin in the game that's going to make more money with more work. Very difficult. Just kind of underscores my suggestion that we have an expert there who has no skin in our game, and the expertise. Upset. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there any kind of reporting that's done? Is there any kind of documentation at the end of the year in terms of what's been produced or accomplished? Do you just get direct updates, or how do we know what's actually happened within a year with each of these years of contract?
Through the chair, we get monthly reports on the whole of the project, which gives us updates on all the permitting, all the financing, all the construction activities. And those are freely available, and we can share those with folks who are interested. I should loop back to the previous comment, though. To the extent the Assembly is concerned that Jacobs has an interest in creating work for itself, the work that Jacobs is doing is maintaining the program management office and overseeing the design and the construction. If the construction is $60 billion or $1 billion or $1, it's not materially changing the scope of the work that they are doing. And I don't know, Jeff, you want to say anything more to help us get visibility into that?
I would love to say a few words. So we were retained as global program management experts to help the city understand how to deliver this elephant. We don't get paid on a cost basis. Okay? Our mission, our core mission, is to find the most cost-effective solution that meets all the requirements. We don't decide any requirements. Those are approved by others. We get requirements from the user group, which we did in 2014, and that's how we got to the solution where we're at. Okay? We advise on current technology, current code requirements, and all those types of things to make sure we have something that's modernized in terms of meeting current safety standards and things like that. We are not cost-driven. In fact, the situation that we're in is a big disappointment to us because we deliver a product that we can't afford. So we, in fact, did not find the most cost-effective solution. So disappointing to us, but we don't get paid extra. We don't get paid as some kind of a percentage of total cost or anything like that.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Right, but the project was delivered we can't afford, and so we're now going to extend the contract to come up with a project we can't afford. And so that is actually the mechanism by which the question can come up of, oh wait, we're going to have to continue. We might rise above 30 million and into 50, 70, depending on when we finally achieve a workable product. And so that is part of it. And then another part of it is it's hard. There is assertion of the potential conflict, maybe from work in the past, but also from the question of can the project manager help us define an actual total scope when they are kind of in the mix of helping us target the actual products that we're delivering? Are they managing the project, or are they developing the scope? You know, there are questions that are, and I don't mean to attack Jacobs. I just know that it is very important that we have very clear review and analysis. Like, we hired Northern Compass and Ascent for ourselves so that we could have somebody who wasn't tied into every level of this and for the last 3 iterations of it, so we can understand what we're getting is clear and factual.
But assertions of conflict of interest are easy to make and very difficult to prove. And I'll give you an example. I have the utmost respect for Roe Sturgielewski, but Roe was employed by another firm who competed for this contract and did not win it. So if somebody could assert that Roe is a conflict of interest giving you advice that's maybe contrary to where the program is headed, and I don't believe that. I believe that Roe is professional and he gives the best advice he can. And Jacobs is in that same position. So assertions of conflict of interest are easy to make, but I would be happy to address any specific comments or actions that you have concerns about.
And if I can jump in, I think the second half of this presentation may bring some helpful clarity and maybe what you guys are looking for. So I'll pivot to that. But Jacobs does what we tell them to do. They are the program management. They don't make the design choices. And so I'm going to use that as my pivot to get to the second half.
Briefly, though, you just said Jacobs does what we tell them to do. You told us we hired them to do the things that we're trying to tell them to do.
No.
You did. That's
no.
what you said.
Let me get to the second half of this because I think it'll provide the clarity.
And actually, before you move on, Mr. France.
You know what, I'll hold so Mr. Falvey can continue.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so reviewing what happened with the petroleum cement terminal to set up what might be our work in progress, better mousetrap going forward. How do we actually do the petroleum cement terminal? You guys know the story. We had 2 charrettes where we tried to get stakeholder input, we tried to get everybody on the same page. And then after that, so we had everybody come in the same room, we sent out our design reviews, didn't get a lot of comments back, and then we all know what the summer felt like when we got back to it. But basically, we went all the way from, hey, what do you guys think we should design? Great. Jacobs go off and design that, retain COE, get them to get it to 100% design, and then we negotiate this contract for construction management with Pacific File. Assembly says yes, we're going to hand that off to Jacobs. We all recognize that was not a great process. And I think the reasons that was not a great process is that there was slippage in between the very first 2014 decision of what do we want to build, what do we want to design, and then an awakening that happened at the 11th hour where we said, great, here it is, 100% design, here's what it costs, here's how we're going to pay for it. The better mousetrap, I think, would have much greater involvement and alignment at the very beginning where we hand off to Jacobs the thing that we want to have the designers go design. So, to make that concrete, there are a couple documents which we could share with everybody that I think are the tablets that we give to Jacobs. Jacobs prepares these after we tell them what to do. So there is first a program preliminary design narrative where Jacobs says, hey, I'm an engineering firm, I'm managing the program management officer, I'm going to hire a designer of record for you. What do you want me to tell the designer of record to do? And you got to write that down somewhere. And so the preliminary design narrative says, hey, we want you to build a port. It should have it should be able to accommodate these kind of design vessels. It should have these kind of seismic performance requirements. We're going to take these kind of design approaches. We'll do a pile-supported wharf and not a sheet pile or anything else. And we have all these different design considerations. Once that is ripened up further, it becomes the ultimate program prescriptive information. So these are things that Jacobs doesn't tell itself what to do. Jacobs says to the administration in the PCT category after the charrettes, what do you want me to tell the designer of record to go off and build? And we tell them. The previous administration said, go on this path. So that's pivoting up to what I think there is an emerging consensus for is, I think it would behoove us all to not have the future administration or the current administration design program narrative or prescriptive information and inputs for the cargo solutions going forward sort of in the dark in that 5-year period from we've asked everybody what they want all the way to we've got it 100% design. And what we talked about in our meeting on Friday was potentially actually encoding a new steering committee, building a real board and commission that we put in code. And so here was my pitch that I put together at 11 o'clock last night. And I'm just going to bounce this off of you in real time. It is a Word document, so maybe we even edit it a little bit together. We have a whole suite of technical advisory boards in code now. The pitch would be, let's add another one, and we'll call it something like the Port Modernization Design Steering Committee. It starts with the usual things that we recognize. We need capacity for fuel, cement, and cargo. We've got really old facilities now. We've got good solutions for cement and the beginnings of solutions for petroleum. We need to pivot to cargo. Might be most cost effective. We certainly are hoping it's most cost effective to finish the fuel story just by clamping it on to the future cargo solution. So if we do a steering committee structure, that could do all the things that we recognized were suboptimal in the petroleum cement terminal experience. We'll have this regular forum for stakeholder engagement and input. We will make sure that everybody's bringing the best information to the table, and we'll charge that commission with figuring out the cost implications from the beginning and in real time over time. That hopefully that would result in an alignment on the various design choices, and it would provide a structure that outlives all of this. Further, the way we are generally wired is the administration cooks stuff up and says, may I have money for this, and may I award a contract to this individual? And the Assembly says yes or no. I think it probably makes more sense here to say, hey, as soon as we have the basis of design documents, that program narrative, and then the prescriptive requirements, those would be recommended by the steering committee to the mayor would then propose something to the Assembly, and then the Assembly would say, at the beginning, like what we should have done in 2014, this is what we want you to hire the designer to go design. Because we don't want to get in the place where we brought a design from 35 to 65 to 95 to ready to go, 100%, and then we're questioning whether we designed correctly the thing that we actually want to go procure. So the very first scratch pad draft of this says, hey, let's have a committee. We'll have, this was sort of a take on Dave Karp's idea, but this is all in Word on draft. Change it in real time if we want. Here is the opening bid. We could have 9 voting members and 3 non-voting members. The purpose would be for them to develop and recommend adoption the basis of design documents for the cargo and the fuels infrastructure. And that would include, what do we want the seismic criteria to be? What do we want the design vessel requirements to be? What are the draft requirements? What are our dock and trestle configurations? How does it work? Is it a pile-supported structure? Is it a bulkhead structure? And how is it all sequenced? And, much better than we did in the petroleum cement terminal experience, to do that with ongoing cost-benefit info. So we're always estimating what the various alternatives cost, and then presumably building the plan of finance off of that, saying how much of this would be coming from tariffs and how much of it would be coming from grants and other things. Who would be on this committee? I don't know. You guys tell me. Here's a first pitch. All of this is easy to change. To ensure the continuity, I think it makes sense for the director of the port to be on it. To ensure mayoral engagement, I think it makes sense for there to be somebody that the mayor picks. To make sure that we understand what's going on for the folks who are on the load on, load off cargo scheme, that we'd have someone who knows those operations well, who can represent those interests. And likewise for the roll-on, roll-off. And because we hope that fuel becomes part of the next cargo solution, fuel too. Now we've heard from Roe and from the Assembly from others that we need to do a better job of making sure the rest of the rail belt understands that what we do here is affecting their cost of living too. And so it would be, I think it would be all to the good if we could get members from our neighboring communities up and down the rail belt to participate as well. I'll say it may be a challenge to get that kind of interest, because when we call and say, do you want to help us design the port of Alaska and Anchorage, they may say yes, they may say no, but we're hopeful and we could reserve seats for them. And then because there is likely to be a request for funds from the state somehow, some way, an invitation to the state as well. So that was sort of the first scratch pad idea. Those aren't all of the interests that would be interested in what the port looks like, but we thought we would invite someone from the military to be a non-voting member, mostly because I don't think it's realistic to ask the military to actually vote. I think they would give us information that they probably wouldn't want to make specific recommendations. Because we think that there is a federal request, we could designate a seat for the congressional delegation to send us somebody if they'd like. And because we really do want this to be informed by actual PEs, we thought we'd extend an invitation to the American Society of Civil Engineers, someone to sort of be there. Meanwhile, the committee would be staffed with the firepower of the Program Management Office, and certainly could be requesting the kinds of documents that we have seen internally over the last several years, where we compared monopiles versus dolphin piles, or loading arms versus a hose tower. But they would have the structure to make these decisions in light of full information. But all this is opening bidding. Any of this could change. How would we actually do it? I think we want this to be a real no-kidding process, where they have public meetings, they're publicly noticed, they meet as often as they need to. We'd say the quorum is a majority of the voting members, so if in fact we can't get Matsu, Fairbanks, Kenai, or the state to show up, we can still actually make decisions. The port director could serve as the chair, do a majority vote, have real agendas, real audio recordings, and that what they're ultimately doing is saying, hey, this is the thing that this group believes, you should tell the designer to go design, ultimately the municipality should build. So they would propose to the mayor that the assembly should adopt this basis of design documents package. And that would do that by majority vote. If anybody didn't agree, then they could send in some kind of minority report. Then what happens? Then after you get that, the then mayor, who's not going to be us, then says, all right, I'm taking this expert advice from this panel, and I'm going to propose back to the assembly what I think we should be doing. And if that in any way differs from what the steering committee cooked up, make that super visible and explain what you're doing. And then ultimately, because at the end of the day, the assembly would have to give the money to the administration to go do this and approve the award of a construction contract, the assembly at the very beginning would say, let's hold a public hearing, and we'll say, what are we actually approving, no kidding, as the basis of design documents for what comes next. So that's the current pitch, but I should say that was just what I cooked up from our loose conversations on Friday last night at about 11 p.m. And if anybody has a different view, I'm all ears.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Got some applause from Mr. Dyson. And I agree. I think this, on its face, seems like a really good and interesting idea that addresses a lot of the issues we've been talking about. I still think, I think it actually dovetails with some of the recommendations made by Rose Group, particularly the staffing. So I think you mentioned, I think you said there PM&E would be the entity you thought might staff it, but regardless of who it is, our best commissions and our best, what are you calling this? This is a, not commission, but steering committee. Yeah, steering committee have dedicated staffers, right? And I think there's willingness on the maybe it's in fourth quarter or first quarter budget revisions even, but we will find a dedicated staffer, or staffers plural, because this is such a huge project. And we can figure out how to pay for it. We pay for it out of, the additional funding we're getting from the MLB sale, or we somehow charge it to the project itself. There's a mechanism to do that. I think that's how it was done in the Denida Center. I wasn't around for that, but I believe there was a dedicated office in the mayor that had an employee or even a couple employees that was their job, was to manage that project. And to me, that seems like it would dovetail very well with this, because they would be the staffers that would be helping run this process for the year or years it took. What do you think about that?
I think it's certainly a doable idea. I don't know how it happened in the Denina world. I think in my own thinking, I was thinking that we would unleash the project management office that we're spending the millions of dollars on every year to staff this committee, so that the users could then say, we need some analysis of this versus this, and Jacobs would assist. But if the desire to have another municipal employee, I'm not sure it's critical, but we wouldn't.
It could be in PM&E as well, but from our budget discussions over the course of last year, PM&E works hard. They're busy. So are you. This is on your plate. You've got a lot of other things to do. We've got public safety challenges. We've got homelessness. We've got a million things. But I think this is big enough that I at least feel like a dedicated staff or staffers is warranted, and we should be able to find the money for it given the scale. Because, I agree. PM&E might be the place to house it, but I think PM&E employees right now are working. They're all pretty busy, right?
Yeah, I guess just to clarify, I was saying the project management office, which is the name that Jacobs goes by. I actually don't think PM&E would be the right.
Okay, fine. That's fine. But then I guess I have a more of a disagreement with you, because I actually want them to be part of the municipality, as opposed to part of Jacobs, the staffers for this.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
But when you have a crisis, make another committee. But I think that what I take, the key element from Ascent's work is build to the budget, and I don't see that here. We made a committee, and they are doing essentially what we've done before. It's like, okay, design and improvement criteria, but you could end up again, but we don't have the money for that. And I almost think if we could figure out a budget, we don't even need the committee. Then you just say, do the best you can, given the criteria. Make it as seismic as you can, make it, all that other stuff. But here's your money. So and that should come forward.
So my response to that is, I think there is interest in, certainly interest in cost containment. I think that what we're struggling with is, before you have a very preliminary sense of what it is you want to build, it is difficult for me to see how you say, this is the budget designed to get, without having that money in hand. Like if we had $600 million and made the choice that was the only money we would ever spend on this project, then I totally understand why you would say, that's it. This is the total amount of money you have. Whatever you can afford with this, that's all you're going to get. But we don't have any of the money in hand right now, so we're not designing with $0. I think the way that what I'm envisioning is, we make these choices about the number of docks we're building, the number of trestles, the kinds of seismic resilience, with full information about what we think those cost implications are. So we picked this one, we didn't pick this one, and that changed the price by this rough order of magnitude. And that at the end of that, once we have said, as a matter of public policy, this is the thing we want to build, we would have then our preliminary cost estimate for that. And then we could say, here is the plan of finance by which we think we actually get that money, and then you could put a lid on it. But because we don't have the money now, I don't know what number you would pick. You said, here's the budget, designed to this budget. I have no idea what number you would pick.
Thank you. Ms. Salatel?
Thanks. I fully disagree with that last point. I think you can start with a not to exceed amount and try, and then if it says, this is completely impossible, you could say it's completely impossible. You could start to put some parameters around it. Google, and that's really unscientific, but can tell me what ports generally have cost, historically. And I know we have unique challenges and we want to do unique things, but I think you can get a ballpark or a stadium around it that starts to put you in the realm of possibility. I disagree with that. I do agree with Mr. Dunbar. I think we need someone who is going to shepherd this process through, that we know has in the municipality, who has some continuity with the municipality through whatever changes may come. And I think that person needs to be that liaison between whatever committee there may be or working group, the administration, and kind of just be that person in the know that's really full on this all the time, who can talk with the contractor as well. I'm actually uncertain if you go this route 100% how it dovetails with what Jacobs is doing. I have a bit of a disconnect, because what you're asking for is a lot of people to create the basis for the design documents. And then what are you hoping that it would kick back to Jacobs to then make the design? Because I think what you've done here in this document is kind of set the narrative for the design. Well, if you've done that, then what do you need the commission for?
Okay, so to clarify on that front, the commission doesn't do the design. The commission gives the first inputs to Jacobs to run the project. Meaning, if you were to look through these prescriptive information, someone has to say, what code are you building to? How seismically resilient do you want this thing? What vessels are going to be accommodated by this, and what aren't? What are the draft depths going to be? That information gets handed over to Jacobs, and then they execute it. And that's thousands of plan sets and hundreds of construction documents. None of that is for the steering committee. The steering committee are the folks who say, we actually don't need a 50-foot draft, because we're not likely to ever have a vessel like that ever come up here. And we don't really need 6 trestles on this dock, because we can get away logistically with just 3. So they're the ones who are making just the very highest order input requirements that then the Jacobs folks run away with and actually hire a designer to go design, and then hire a construction firm, and then oversee the actual construction.
so I understand, this document you have here, which kind of already lays out some parameters, they would winnow that down then? Because, I mean, we have this work. Like, what is wrong with this work? I mean, or is this what resulted in a $2 billion port?
The latter. So
Okay.
what happened in the first go-round was we said, what does everybody think they want or need? Then we took that information, put it in as the previous administration, our administration, put it in and said, this is it. This is what we're doing. We didn't know what this was going to cost. We found out later that it cost $2 billion. People were not regularly engaged in this, and we fully designed the whole petroleum cement terminal and said, we're 100% designed, we're ready to go. And then people said, wait a minute, maybe we want to change all of these things. So I would envision the steering committee would say, hey, this is a first draft, but we're starting over with a blank sheet of paper, and we're going to build a new version of these documents, but with more information, with some rough order of magnitude cost estimates and some greater discussion of the trade-offs for the paths not taken. We chose this path and not this path in light of this cost information.
Okay. I'll have more later, I'm sure.
Thank you, Mr. Constant.
Thank you, kind of short story. Well, preliminarily, I'm very in support of this idea. I want to hear from users what their thoughts are. I don't agree the ME would be right. If whoever would manage this project for the ME would really has to be in the port. It has to be someone who is living, drinking, eating, sleeping, and breathing port if we're going to have a person or a group that is identified that is only run for this. And I have previously stated today, I would like the port to tell us how that should be organized, not for us to tell them, because they really are the subject matter experts for us at this time. To the question about developing without having money in hand a budget, I think that you actually would be wise, or we would be wise, to be working on both efforts simultaneously. One is a kind of a big picture budget framework, and then one is an operational framework for what we're going to build. And that those two processes should move along simultaneously until we come to a point where they cross and reality is achievable. And what I mean by that is, from the funding perspective, we have to start on the funding requests now for whatever we're going to build, and so we should be looking at the whole, not just the part, because we don't want the part to drive the whole, we want the whole to drive the part. And so we can work on those pieces, I think, in parallel, or even till they converge and we get a project. Then to the one flaw, coming back to this question of even just the perception of conflict, if the suggestion is that our project management contractor would lead this committee, then they would, but that's what
Staff the committee.
Right, but staffing in the world of public process are the ones who actually define what comes out, because the staff do the work, the staff do the reports, the staff massage everything to make it what they want to see, right? And so what we have to do is protect against that. We have to establish a clear boundary between who the project management team is, implementing the goals, and how we're developing the concept and the framework for the goals. Because if we don't, we will never get past the perception that the contractor is developing for themselves the juiciest work plan that they can. And so that, to me, actually crystallizes just where the perception of the issue comes from. I think we can't allow them to staff this project if they're going to implement what comes out of it. Because in my experience, our staff, we depend on them to lead and take our policy advice and then incorporate it, but for the most part, the staff is pretty independent in our municipality. The executive is very strong in Anchorage. And so with that, I would really like to hear from the users, their perspective on this question.
Sure, we're almost there. Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of what Chris said. I said payment because I thought that's what you were saying. I don't think it should necessarily go there. I don't think that what you propose, that ordinance, is in conflict with what Salva said or what Mr. Wellington said necessarily. I mean, I think certainly that group can and should work with some kind of general sense of we cannot go over this much money, right? And make those whittling decisions with an eye on that. But I don't necessarily think it should necessarily be in the port. And the reason is because, part of the reason we got here is because the sort of political leadership in the mayor's office and the assembly were felt at least disconnected from what was happening at the port. And I really respect people at the port, but they're running a port, day to day. and they are an independent entity in a lot of ways. And so when they did all this great work, when it came back to us, we had a big problem. And I feel like we started moving forward when you yourself, Mr. Falsey, got more directly involved. Maybe that's a misperception on my part, but it seemed like you got involved. There were some charrettes, and things started to move again. So to me, it would be housed in the office of the mayor or some other place like that. That's very close to maybe in your office, something like that. And we could deal with those details. But I think it should not be. I agree with Mr. Constant that it should not be the contractor that would later on have some kind of financial stake. I also don't think it should be in the port because I think there is an isolating effect from the rest of the municipality when you do that. And again, that's not to try to disparage the port at all. They do great work. But we just went through this where we had a misalignment, I think, between the political leadership and the port leadership.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Oh, and I want to agree with the thing about the staffing too. Staffing is hugely important in what actually comes out of any kind of commission or entity like this. And you can see it with the Budget Advisory Commission, for example. Sorry.
So what I didn't mean at all to impugn your company's integrity. And I just say most of these firms, particularly on the engineering side, who do these kind of works, their basis for getting new work is their credibility. And putting their finger on the scale to tip it in their favor, unlikely to get away with this. If nothing else, their competitors would hold that up, and then they would lose business. So credibility and professionalism is a huge issue, and I didn't mean to in any way imply that. The other thing that's really tough is when you got large projects, you always want to try to be careful to never do anything in the next step that precludes doing the best thing in the big picture. And you get pushed into compromises that makes the next steps or the ideal that may even preclude them happening, but drives up costs. And that's the situation we're in. And it's the worst of all. Lots of different things done, bad work in the past, huge lawsuits, and oh, by the way, we got to keep the thing operating. This PCT thing, my sense is that what we've come up with, administration, is it's pushed off to the south end, doesn't preclude most of the best things we want to do for the rest of it. And they kept us going on the piece that was most critical. So, anyways, thank you.
Thank you. All right. So with that, I'll go ahead and ask any of the port users group if any of them are here and want to speak on this.
So good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm Val Dreyfus. I'm Vice President of Matson here for Alaska, and also serve with Alex as co-chair of the Port of Alaska Users Group that we formed in May. So where should we start? I think my first comment would be there are lessons learned from the PCT, and I think the formation of the Port Users Group and the communication that has come with Roe, and I compliment Roe and Ascent on the report that they did. It's very voluminous, as you all know, but it contained lots of very, very valuable information. And I think the underlying issue is we've got a port with piles that need to be replaced. I mean, that's the issue. And then how do we do that most cost effectively as quickly as possible? We have formed a roadmap in concert with the port, with Jacobs and Steve Rebuffo in the port, and I think that's a very important step forward that we reviewed with the community last Friday, and that provides very critical next steps as to what are the requirements, challenging some of those requirements, whether it's the number of cranes, a single berth versus not a single berth, whether it's the number of trestles, what's the alignment of the berth. All those things, and it was talked about earlier, need cost benefit. Why are we spending this money, which drives the value engineering? Because we know there's not some big pot of money out there that's coming in here to save us all. We need to build a port that meets the needs of our community and our environment as cost effectively as possible. So, Alex?
Well said, Val. So, no, I mean, from my standpoint, I think it's really important that we do kind of adopt the lessons learned from the PCT, and I think the value engineering idea is a great idea, but as Mr. Falsey pointed out, that work needs to be done on the front end. And, I also, we've been pretty adamant about needing a clear, transparent, and very defined process with, as Val covered, stakeholders, who are the decision makers, what are the milestones, and then what's the conflict resolution. And I think what, with regard to the steering committee, and I've not seen that, and I think it's great work. It's a really good start for a framework that I think would be very effective in this process. And so, I think we need to get some feedback and figure out how to codify that. But and I with Val also, it's the same thing for us. I mean, the time is definitely ticking, and we've, from a tote perspective, we've hired our own port design and engineering firm, as you guys have worked with one. And, we've looked at the assessment, and we've started vetting out our own alternatives, and we look forward to working with the team here on building an affordable port that meets our minimum requirements.
Could you state your name again for the record, please?
So, Alex Hofling, and I'm the TOTE Vice President General Manager for Alaska.
Thank you. And I'll get to you. Any other port users that want to speak on this?
Reveiw, Polsky, Petrostar. So echoing on what everything was said by Alex and Val, thank you. I think this is a great step to avoid repeating some of the mistakes and the missteps with the PCT. One suggestion is this is the committee that is being proposed is focused on the basis of design. I would recommend that it has the longevity to oversee the construction as well, because with disputes, and it's going to be an ongoing process. And so rather than recreating the wheel, you have something that can take it from phase 2 cradle to the grave, if you will, and then codify the right reporting and dispute resolution right. If the committee proposes something that doesn't necessarily seem as the best decision by the mayor, how does that get brought to this group to resolve that disconnect? But I think this is a great starting point, and really appreciate that, Bill. So,
and if I can underscore one thing that the user said, one of the things that is very encouraging to us is that now everyone has brought their own firepower to the table. So Alex just mentioned that TOTE has hired its own engineering firm, Ascent has its own engineering firm. So in this kind of model, even as Jacobs is staffing the proposed committee, because it is the entity that has the information to make data-rich decisions, none of that gets spoon-fed to anybody. It gets handed over to, if you imagine that there is a Matson and a TOTE representative who may be representing ROBO and RORO interests, they will have their own firepower to vet any alternative things that have just been sent to them by Jacobs, and will fully be capable of putting alternative ideas on the table.
And we look forward to coalescing our ideas with Jacobs. We want to challenge our own ideas, so we look forward to it.
All right.
Go ahead.
Bert Mattingly, Minzy Aviation. One of the questions asked was, how do we generate more construction, more interest in the process? And my suggestion is we go out and ask them. With a customer, they're basically a customer. We got to find out what their problem is and how to change it. My thought is, it's not going to change till we change something. And then the other question I had was regarding the design, build, maximum guaranteed price, and how that would unfold, Roy, is if we had that in place for the phase 1 of the PCT. In other words, your document says it's phases. How much detail is the price comparison in your vision? And how would it unfold? In other words, would the phase 1 would have been 61 million, and they would have built to that?
Thank you, Bert, for the opportunity to jump in. Steering committee, great idea. What Bill's put forward, a lot of good stuff there. And what Bert has touched on the design, build, maximum price, one of the places where I feel like we went off the rails somewhat, and this relates to the PCT, is we had very prescriptive defined ideas of exactly how we're going to do that. And the way that came up with, we started with design requirements and everything else. We did preliminary design work, we did final design work, and we got locked into a very detailed prescriptive element, and the PCT went from 35 million to 210 million. And so what I had recommended, or what we had recommended for the next phase of the project, was the design build maximum price. And so you define things like the group's talking about. You figure out what the vessels are going to be coming. You figure out what sort of draft you're going to do. But you don't necessarily get into all of the prescriptive design elements that under the roadmap that you guys spoke to positively, that process is going to take you into a place where you come up with you're not going to get the benefit of designing to budget if you go forward with that place. So I'm really in a lot. There's a lot of positive stuff, the harmony that's happening, all that's good, but pull back a little bit in terms of what that initial effort is going to be, and then allow, rather than turn it over for a prescriptive design, allow the private sector to come back in and help define what those solutions are going to be. And you're going to cut costs. So to directly answer Bert's costs or question, I believe you could have clearly cut that project in half if you would have used a different format.
Thank you.
And it is easy to say.
All right, I have a few questions here. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you. For these gentlemen, with kind of saying, looking at your operations and designing something at a not to exceed level, is that unreasonable? Like to kind of say, can you do it for X number of dollars, or try to?
I mean, it's a good question, but it's kind of a chicken. To me, it's the chicken or the egg, right? What is it I need? And then you really have to decide what are those minimum requirements, right? And then you're going to say, okay, how much is that going to cost? Right? And there may be other things that it's like, well, you don't need to do that extra one. We can't afford it, right? That would have to come downstream, or we just can't do it. But you got to get in that dialogue of what is it that what are the requirements?
And I think you can quickly get there, what you're talking about. But I agree with Val, where we need 35 feet of water. Otherwise, and if we can't get 35 feet of water here, we're going to go to a place where we can get 35 feet of water. We have to be able to safely moor up a ship. We need to cover the very basics, put some costs around it, and I think that is a good place to start with what you're talking about.
Do you know what that is, though? I mean,
Well, so
either through looking at the current criteria that you could kind of go in.
Yeah,
and
that's a
narrow
great question.
That down, or you kind of already know what is required for you.
yeah, I mean we're in a, we've outlined all of our minimum requirements. We've hired our own firm. They've vetted them. They've been up here. We're gonna be sharing those ideas with Jacobs to making sure we haven't missed anything to get a rough order of magnitude cost as a starting point. And from my perspective, we're really close.
Cool, fantastic, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, so you both talked around it, but you never directly stated it. Is this committee something that is the right fit for what you think we need to do going forward?
Yeah, I think we feel that a steering committee is needed, and we talked about that last week. Whether this is the exact formation, I wouldn't be prepared to comment
Right,
on
of
today.
course. Yeah, no,
But
because we're
there
not-
is a committee, in our view, and we talked about it last week, was conflict resolution. So when we don't have agreement, right? And if I were the mayor, which I said last week I'm not and won't be, but how does that person make a decision? They're really relying on some expert to say, this is a recommendation, and that's the idea behind the steering committee. So it's one more level between the users and the port to come to the meeting.
So I just follow up on that. We heard that the framework is already drafted around a design committee. Somebody suggested a construction committee, but it also seems like the other key piece is the finance piece. That's also an element that mixes in all of this, and so it seems like it's a really good start, and we have our work ahead. We would like to hear from the users how you would refine what's proposed. So as we move forward into drafting towards something that's introducible, we don't have to go backwards to get it where it needs to be.
No, and when we met last week, which was a week ago today, Bill said you were going to look at this, which obviously did at 11 o'clock last night, and now we've got a chance to have some dialogue and come up with, I think, I'm sure we can find a place where we can reach agreement for a recommendation. And I'll also add, we have already scheduled meetings internally with our consultants. They were here actually last week. We brought them here to participate in last week's meeting. We've scheduled meetings with the Port and Jacobs as part of these key requirements. How many cranes, how many trestles, the berth, all these things that need to be addressed. And part of that is cost-benefit analysis. How do you get to the point that, okay, that fourth crane, what's the just cost-benefit to do that? And we have to be able to articulate, yeah, it makes sense because, and it's affordable, or you know what, it'd be nice, but you can't afford it. And I think that's a lot of these criteria that we have to go through. Extending the berth 140 feet.
That's a good question.
Right? Is that the right decision? That has to be vetted.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciated your chicken or the egg comment because I'm feeling like that definitely is what's going on here between when we talk about scope and we talk about budget. And, describing it as what meets the needs as cost effectively as possible, I think you said, and also building an affordable port that meets our basic need is absolutely critical. And I know, Mr. Falsey, you said that as well in your presentation. And I think, what we know as far as like upper limit, $2 billion, that's way too much. So clearly, it's going to come way down from that. And I understand from talking with Jacobs as well and looking through all those, design options, there were a lot of wants in there that had been priced out. And I think focusing on what is our need and how can we even go out and ask for funding when we don't have a clear idea of exactly what we need.
Minimum requirements.
Minimum requirements, not necessarily the bells and whistles. So I really appreciate your approach. And, to Mr. Constance's point about finance, I hadn't thought about that. Bill, when you had put up the makeup of the commission, steering committee, is there someone on there, who necessarily has finance experience or that would be helpful in that conversation, to keep that connection? Everyone says it's a discussion point. And then I was also curious, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Balsey, as to what's the thinking on not having the engineer be a voting position?
So I'll circulate this draft to everybody because nobody's seen it because I finished it 15 minutes into this meeting, and we can all mark it up. On those questions, no, there isn't anybody who's sort of in the finance flavor here, but partly that was because I was thinking everyone should be interested in the finance, meaning that we all understand that the way this story is most likely to end is that the lion's share of this gets paid for through tariffs, and we're constantly running those numbers, then whoever is representing Lolo, Roro, and Port of Alaska and Mayor interests should be keenly interested in that. And that may be the only reason why Matsu, Kenai, and Fairbanks are motivated to play along with us too, because we're going to be changing their CPI if we change the price of all the basket of goods that gets delivered around the state. But just because I wrote it that way last night, this morning, doesn't mean it has to stay that way. So if there's a better way to do that, I'm all in favor of it. Or if there's a way to say the mission, to more strongly encode the mission is supposed to be finance flavored, that's all to the good as well. There's no real magic in who was voting and non-voting other than I think we wanted there to be an odd number of voting members. We didn't think the military would be comfortable sending anyone who was supposed to vote. And I figured that the engineer would in some ways be there as a further truth checker, so that doesn't smell right to me, but if we wanted to make him or her a voting member, I don't have strong views about that at all.
And may I follow up, Mr. Chair, if you all have thoughts on the makeup of the steering committee beyond what's here?
From my perspective, it's a great start. I think, I'd like to chew on it a little bit, but you've got a good, diverse representation of stakeholders that will be impacted by the decisions made for the port, that's a good start.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'd be willing to serve on member E, a member familiar with the fuel port. Interested. I'm a certified managerial accountant, so I have financial.
So I'll add one other comment relative to financing. I do think, and I think it was said earlier, a lot of these things are happening concurrently, right? It's not like this, it's not going to be sequential. And finance is huge. And whether the number is 200 million or 500 million or 800 million, whatever the number is, we need a financing plan. And we should be, and there's, as I think Mark Betts mentioned earlier, the timing and sequencing when you look at financing is also important because you got to get in front of the decision-making process for that financing in order to get this. So we really should have a financing program plan, regardless what the number ends up, right? But pick a number.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton, and then I'll go to Mr. Costa.
So one of you said that the basic problem is the port has piles that need to be replaced quickly.
Correct.
Would we be here if they weren't rotting? Could we just go replace those piles and move on and we're happy?
Say that one more time. If we were to just replace the piles, would we not be here?
And then we're good.
I think we'd be having a very different conversation because that's the underlying issue, right?
Because we were told it would be $75,000 to $100,000 to replace the pile. But we could just go through, replace those piles, would be the quickest thing to do because we were told this needs to happen lickety-split. Because any day we could have a thing collapse.
So I'm not an engineer.
Yeah.
I know that I
don't think it's that simple, but I'll defer to the.
Can I speak to
like
that?
maybe perhaps talk about grant improvement.
Nothing's ever simple.
So one of the main problems that I would see in that is, so Matson is looking at totally coming up with new vessels, and it would work somewhat for, let's say, on the towed side, but you'd still have sedimentation issues. It would potentially work on the POL2. There's permitting issues associated with that, but the real drawback where that wouldn't work, I would think, would be on the Matson berth, where they have 37 or 38 gauge cranes now, and their vessels, I mean, those cranes just simply wouldn't work, I don't think, for the new vessel. So likely, I mean, that dock's wearing out, and so there has to be a solution that solves Matson's next version of their vessel. So it needs to be, but for that, I think you could just replace pile.
Can I we actually need to wrap up.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
Okay, so I agree with Roe what he said, that essentially Matson's solution for the Terminal 1 is a new terminal. Again, it doesn't make sense to widen out, have a partially old terminal and partially new terminal. So you're talking about a solution for tow.
Okay, so and that's good because
Okay,
what I see is
let
we've
me
got a
finish.
port.
Let
I'm
me
sorry.
finish.
I thought you were done.
The problem we run into is code compliance. Nobody can come to an agreement right now on whether we can just replace piles in kind that doesn't meet anywhere near any current code. That's a substantial renovation, and the building official has said that has to meet current code, and you can't do that. So that's a big, big conversation.
And Mr. Weddleton, this is something that has come up with our own consultants, and we're going to be working through with Jacobs.
Okay, and my thinking on this is, how much should we be on the hook for? We have a port, make that survivable, it's falling apart, fix that, basically. And if Matson wants more, they pay. And if you want more, you pay. So we have a minimum amount we're going to be in for, and that's $100,000 per piling or whatever the building code guy would say. And all these other cranes and so on, if you want it, pay for it. That's our plan of finance.
Well, you need ships, right, in order. So we just got through a nearly $1 billion ship program for the ships in Hawaii, which includes cranes as part of that whole program. But we have to have a terminal and facility to support the ships that are needed to support the market. And ships are getting bigger, right? They're getting wider. And then you need cranes that have greater outreach. You need cranes instead of 50 gauge that are 100 gauge cranes. That's a safety issue, that's an operating efficiency issue, that's a standard issue in the industry.
I got
There's
that.
lots of things.
So build what you need.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, just this whole conversation under Rose tables, planning, reevaluating pile drilling for new and renovation and place work. And so that's certainly part of the conversation. And the question of building official code, it's interesting. And I look forward to us having a conversation about this ordinance. And to those who are interested, I think now is not the time to say I'm interested in serving, but time to give us feedback on the ordinance itself, how it could be better structured. And with that, I'm grateful for everybody's input and participation.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank the stakeholders for all of your work, the administration for coming up with this, and we'll keep moving forward.